Section 3 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 404, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 18b, The League and its Mandates, Part 2. Subsection, Establishment of the Mandate System. While the Allies occupied, or continued to occupy and administer the territories over which they expected to receive mandates, there was much hesitation, uncertainty, and delay about putting the provisions of Article 22 into effect. To be sure, a commission appointed by the Allies met in London during the summer of 1919 and drafted terms for the B and C mandates, but France entered a reservation to these terms as regards the recruitment of native troops, and Japan likewise entered a reservation. Footnote: France had been insistent on the right to recruit native troops, whereas Article 22 allowed militarization of the natives only for police purposes and the defense of territory. Confer Infra, page 500. See subsection B Mandates in Africa within this section. End of footnote. The Council of the League, however, postponed action until August 5, 1920. Then it approved a report presented by Monsieur Imos of Belgium regarding the procedure to be followed. That the principal Allied and associated powers, France, Great Britain, Japan, Italy, and the United States, had the right to appoint the mandatories, Monsieur Imos was certain. But he also felt that the
legal title, a mere matter of form perhaps, but one which should be settled,
must be a double title,
one conferred by the principal powers and the other conferred by the League of Nations.
Accordingly, the principal powers should appoint the mandatory and notify the Council, which would then approve the appointment and define the terms of the mandate. But who should draft the terms of the mandate? Article 22 left this to the Council, if not previously agreed upon by the members of the League. The Council decided that the principal powers should be allowed to draft or propose the terms of the mandates. This procedure was followed. On December 17, 1920, the Council approved the C mandates. Then ensued a long delay before the B mandates were approved on July 17, 1922, and the A mandates for Palestine and Syria on September 29, 1923. No mandate was ever issued for Mesopotamia. Instead, Great Britain set up an Arab kingdom of Iraq in that area, signed a treaty of alliance and supervision with that kingdom on October 10, 1922, and obtained the approval of the League Council on September 27, 1924, for this method of fulfilling the duties of a mandate. Subsection: American Interests. The delays were caused in part, but not exclusively, by the United States. It had been hoped that the United States would assume a mandate and participate in the system. In fact, George Louis Beer, colonial expert of the American Peace Commission at Paris, was to have been the head of the Mandate Division of the League of Nations Secretariat. The Senate, however, was opposed to the acceptance of any mandate and, by withholding the ratification of the Covenant, made it impossible for the United States to enter the League. The United States was soon involved in the mandate question, however, by specific material interests: oils and cables. Oil was the vital question in Mesopotamia and Palestine. On May 12, 1920, an American note was addressed to Great Britain, expressing concern at British actions which had created the unfortunate impression in the minds of the American public that the authorities of His Majesty's government in the occupied regions have given advantages to British oil interests which were not accorded to American companies, and further, that Great Britain had been preparing quietly for the exclusive control of the oil resources in this region. A still more vigorous protest was made on July 28th, after it had become known that on April 24, 1920, France and Great Britain had signed the San Remo oil agreement. The agreement provided that Britain would grant to France, at current market rates, 25% of the oil secured by the British government in Mesopotamia. Or, if the oil were developed by a private company, France would be allowed to buy 25% of the stock of the company. Such an agreement, the American note declared, would result in a grave infringement of the mandate principle, which was formulated for the purpose of removing in the future some of the principal causes of international differences. Lord Curzon tartly replied, on August 9th, that in view of the fact that over 80% of the petroleum production of the world is under American control, and in view of the exertion of American influence to secure cancellation of British oil concessions in Haiti and Costa Rica, the nervousness of American opinion concerning the alleged grasping activities of British oil interests appears singularly unintelligible. As for the principles of the mandate in Mesopotamia, he referred the United States to the League Council. This controversy over oil led the United States government to advance a claim on November 20th to the right as one of the Allied and Associated Powers to a voice in the formation of the mandates. In fact, Secretary Colby requested that the draft mandate forms should be submitted for the United States to consider before being passed on by the League Council. This contention raised interesting problems. It is true that by Article 119 of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had ceded her colonies to the principal Allied and Associated Powers, and as the United States was the principal associated power, these colonies could not be assigned as B and C mandates without its consent. Article 22 of the same treaty, however, stipulated that the terms of the mandates should be formulated either by the members of the League or by the Council, and the United States belonged in neither of these categories. Moreover, the United States had not ratified the Treaty of Versailles, nor had it yet made any peace treaty with Germany. The whole legal situation was confused because of the non-ratification. As regards the A mandates, Syria, Palestine and Mesopotamia, the position was still more difficult, as the United States had neither declared war on Turkey nor signed the Turkish peace treaty at Sèvres. The Treaty of Sèvres, indeed, specifically authorized the principal Allied powers, among which the United States was not included, to select the mandatories and draft the terms of the mandates for Syria, Palestine and Mesopotamia. Regardless of these legal difficulties, the United States persisted in its claims, addressing itself now, by a note of February 21st, 1921, to the Council of the League. Besides repeating its demands for equal opportunity in Mesopotamian oil, and for a right to pass on the mandates, America added a new protest against the assignment of the island of Yap to Japan under a sea mandate, for there were important American cable interests in Yap. The negotiations that ensued are too complicated to chronicle, but the results were surprisingly favourable to the United States. The Allied powers consented to discuss the draft B mandates with the United States. American oil companies secured the promise of a quarter interest in Mesopotamian oil. American interests in the Yap cables were safeguarded by a special treaty with Japan in February 1922, and by a series of other treaties with the mandatory powers. The United States secured in a number of the mandates the same rights as members of the League, a pledge that vested American property rights would be respected, and a promise that copies of the annual reports on the administration of the mandates would be sent to the United States. Subsection A mandates in the Near East. On page 488 there is a map of mandates in the Near East, encompassing the Near East from Turkey down to British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland. The A mandates are the three Arab countries of Syria, Mesopotamia and Palestine. Their combined populations of about 6.5 million, largely Arabic, represent only a fraction of the Arab race, which is scattered throughout the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa and other regions. In them, however, the conflict between Anglo-French imperialism and Arab self-determination is most acute. The publicly professed aim of France and Great Britain in Syria and Mesopotamia was to emancipate these lands from Turkish oppression, to encourage and assist in the establishment of native governments, freely chosen by the populations themselves, and to recognise these governments. So at least ran the Anglo-French Joint Declaration of November 7th, 1918. In the same spirit, Article 22 of the Covenant stated that these countries have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory
until such a time as they are able to stand alone.
Clearly, the A mandates are in theory merely transitional protectorates designed to guide the Arab states into full independence. The French mandate over Syria, including Lebanon, expressly stipulates not only that an organic law or constitution shall be framed in agreement with the native authorities, but also that France shall enact measures to facilitate the progressive development of Syria and the Lebanon as independent states. Article 1. In Palestine, Great Britain has full powers of legislation and administration, but must encourage local autonomy and promote the establishment of the Jewish national home, and the development of self-governing institutions. In Mesopotamia, Great Britain has already established an Arab kingdom, and pledged herself to endeavour to secure its admission into the League of Nations. Certain other general features of the A mandate are worth mentioning. The mandatory is forbidden to interfere with religious liberty, or to discriminate against any of the inhabitants on religious grounds, or to impose its own language through the schools, or to seize to another state any of the mandated territory, or to violate the economic open door, or, in the case of Syria alone, to grant monopolistic concessions for the exploitation of raw materials, or to discriminate against citizens of other members of the League in the granting of concessions. These are liberal provisions, far in advance of the principles applied in many a colony or protectorate not subject to a mandate. The most important and the least successful of the A mandates is Syria. The difficulty has been the costly failure of the French in this case to cope with Arab sentiment. Syria had been freed from the Turks toward the close of the Great War by British and Arab troops, and with British consent an Arab prince, Faisal, had established himself in Damascus as virtual ruler of Syria. Indeed, the French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Pichon, admitted that Faisal had the support of a majority of the population. A commission of investigation sent to Syria by President Wilson during the peace conference discovered the prevalent desire on the part of the Syrian people was for independence and union with other Arab lands. As a mandatory, they preferred United States, or as second choice, Great Britain. Nevertheless, France insisted upon Syria as her share of the Turkish spoils, and in 1919 French troops were sent to replace the British Army of Occupation. The Arab leaders manifested their opposition by holding a Congress of Syrian notables at Damascus in March 1920, and electing Prince Faisal King of Syria and Palestine, and his brother Abdullah they nominated for the crown of Mesopotamia. As Faisal and Abdullah were sons of King Hussein of the Hejaz, the successful consummation of this plan would have meant the confederation of the leading Arab states under Hussein's dynasty. The French, however, were not to be thwarted by Arab kingdoms. General Gouraud, with 90,000 French troops under his command in Syria, peremptorily summoned Faisal to recognize the French mandate. King Faisal complied, but soon afterwards fighting began between his supporters and the French army. Being defeated, Faisal was expelled from Syria, only to be made king of Iraq, Mesopotamia, by the British. This unfortunate beginning handicapped the French from the outset. Having destroyed the Arab government which they found when they came, the French administrators had to build up a new government and seek to overcome native hostility. To satisfy local desires, or possibly to offset Arab nationalism, they divided the country into 5 units. The mountainous area of Lebanon in the south, with its Maronite Christian population, inclined to favour French rule, was enlarged to form Great Lebanon, and given an independent administration and even a national flag of its own, the French tricolour with a cedar imposed on the white ground. Another hill country, southeast of Damascus, inhabited by a religious sect known as the Druzes, was cut off to form the autonomous territory of Jebel Druz. The remainder formed 3 territories, Damascus, Aleppo and Alawite, grouped together as the Federation of Syrian States. Each of these 3 states, it was provided, should have a representative council, which would send 5 delegates to a federal council, which in turn would elect the president of the Federation. This system of native authorities was paralleled and controlled by a system of French officials headed by the French High Commissioner appointed by the French Foreign Minister. Later in 1925, because the Arabs did not relish disunity, Damascus and Aleppo were combined in a state of Syria, and the Alawite state received complete autonomy, the federation being dissolved. Before much progress could be made with this new form of government, the whole situation was altered by a serious Syrian rebellion. A radical French cabinet, the Evoke cabinet, made the mistake of appointing as High Commissioner a certain General Saraya, whose anti-clericalism antagonized the only important pro-French element in Syria, that is, the Christian minority, and whose arbitrary conduct in other matters angered other groups. Rebellion flared up among the Druzes. Saraya's efforts to restore order by having his troops burn down native villages and bombard the city of Damascus only made matters worse. The rebellion spread to other parts of Syria. In dismay, the authorities at Paris recalled General Saraya, promised a reform of the constitutional laws, and sent reinforcements to the army of occupation. The new governor, de Jouvenel, endeavoured by conciliatory methods to persuade the rebels to lay down their arms. Syrian Arab nationalists demanded the reunification of Syria under a nationalist government, and some suggested that France should imitate the policy Britain had pursued in Mesopotamia. The Syrian revolt was a severe test of the mandate system. Would the Mandate Commission have the courage to call France to account for maladministration? It did. France was requested to make a special report on the insurrection. After considering the report and hearing the explanations offered by the French delegate, the Mandates Commission politely announced that the French report
does not fulfill expectations.
In courteous but candid terms, the Commission censured General Saraya for allowing Captain Carbier, French administrator of Jebel Druze, to introduce hasty reforms regarding land tenure and public works in violation of the agreement one of Saraya's predecessors had made with the Druze chiefs to respect their autonomy. The Commission scored Carbier for his
abuses of authority,
Saraya for his
obstinacy,
and breaches of faith with the Druzes, and French administration in general for its
oscillations
of policy and its tendency to substitute direct rule for mandatory advice. One of the causes of revolt, the Commission frankly declared, was the subjection of the Druzes to
excessive demands in the form of forced labour.
These were
severe criticisms,
as a French imperialist journal admitted. Yet the same journal praised the Commission and recommended that France should loyally carry out the mandate principle and sincerely collaborate with the Commission and the League. In this spirit, the French government made every effort to convince the Commission and the League Council that France intended to prepare Syria for self-government in accordance with the mandate system, rather than practice the old policy of imperialist domination. The conflict between Arab nationalism and French imperialism rendered the French mandate in Syria not only less successful than French rule in certain other colonies, but much more expensive than it should have been. Up to October 21st, 1925, the military expenditures in Syria amounted to 2,465,000,000 francs. Syrian taxes sufficed to pay only a very small fraction of the expense. The French Army of Occupation from 1919 to November 5th, 1925, lost 6,622 men, killed or died. The mandate in Syria was an expensive luxury for the French nation. In Palestine, the British mandatory administration conflicted with Arab nationalism in a more serious and more permanent manner. But the British administration handled the problem more skillfully than their French neighbours. Palestine, like Syria, is an Arab country. Of its total population, by the census of 1922, of 757,000, no fewer than 591,000 were Muslims. And of the 73,000 Christians, many were Arabs. There were only 84,000 Jews. Yet under the establishment of the Mandate, Great Britain is to aid in the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, facilitating Jewish immigration, promoting the settlement of Jewish immigrants on the public and wastelands, enabling Jews to acquire Palestinian citizenship, and accepting the Zionist organization as an advisory body on economic, social, and other matters affecting the Jewish settlement. This remarkable project goes back to the historic Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917, pledging the British government to aid the Zionist plan. Of the many influences which brought about that declaration, perhaps the most significant were, first, the desire of British imperialists to secure control of Palestine as a strategic protection for the Suez Canal, and, second, the belief that such a declaration would purchase for the Allies valuable influence and financial support of Jews throughout the world. When the Arab inhabitants of Palestine learned that Great Britain was to have a mandate for Palestine, and that the Zionist plan was to be written into the mandate, there were riots and bitter protests. Great Britain, however, pursued her course. A distinguished English Jew, Sir Herbert Samuel, was sent to Palestine as British High Commissioner from 1920 to 1925. The mandate was drafted, submitted to the League Council in December 1920, approved in 1922, and promulgated in 1923. In drafting the mandate and in framing the new government, Great Britain endeavoured to convince the Arabs that civil and religious rights, as individual citizens, were not to be trampled upon. The administration was to be conducted by a High Commissioner with the aid of an Executive Council of officials and a Legislative Council consisting of 10 officials and 12 elected members, of whom 8 were to be Muslims, 2 Jews and 2 Christians. When the elections were held, however, the Arabs on the whole refrained from voting, and thus caused Sir Herbert Samuel to discard the whole constitution and substitute an appointed official advisory council for the proposed Legislative Council. Passive resistance on the part of the Arabs, however, could not prevent the influx of Jewish immigrants, chiefly from Poland and Eastern Europe, in ever-increasing numbers. By 1925, the number of Jews entering Palestine was 33,801, a startling increase over former years. To be sure, thousands of these incomers found agricultural labour in Palestine unattractive, and soon deserted the country. In 1925, no fewer than 2,141 Jewish immigrants forsook the national home. The majority, however, remained to become citizens, establish Jewish private schools, create new Jewish-owned industries, or settle down on farms. The total number of Jews in 1925 was estimated to be 108,000, and of these 3/4 lived in towns, 1/4 on the land. The Arabs faced the prospect, if this process should continue, of seeing the Jews become the dominant element in the business affairs and perhaps also in the intellectual and political life of the country. Could one obliterate national sentiment, language and religious differences, this venture in Palestine might be regarded as an interesting experiment in the economic redemption of an ancient but unprogressive country and in the creation of a multinational state. Certainly new roads were laid, industries founded, wastelands reclaimed, schools built by the hundred, malaria and other diseases reduced. The Mandate administration even protected the scenery by forbidding the erection of ugly advertisements, yet it is not certain that all these benefits will reconcile the Arabs who yearn for Arab government, good or bad. In considering the first annual report of the Palestine Mandate, in October 1924, the Mandate Commission of the League drew the attention of the League Council to the difficulty inherent in a mandate which sought to reconcile the fostering of a Jewish national home and the protection of Arab rights in the same small country. Even the wisdom and impartiality of the British administrator could not wholly surmount this difficulty. The Council refused, however, to act on this suggestion, and the British government showed no sign of abandoning the Zionist plan. It is worth noting that the Jewish National Home project applies only to the smaller western part of the area under the Palestine Mandate, Transjordan or Karak, east of the Jordan Valley, an area sparsely populated because so much of it is desert, has been allowed autonomy under an Arab prince, the Emir Abdullah, who rules with the assistance of a British advisor, the support of British aeroplanes and armoured cars, and the aid of a small British subsidy. The most successful of the A mandates is Mesopotamia, now known by its Arabic name Iraq. Even before the war, there were strong British oil shipping and strategic interests in Lower Mesopotamia. It was no surprise, therefore,
When, at the outbreak of the war with Turkey in 1914, British troops were landed in that region. Nor was it astonishing that during the war, the British government should have secured from its allies permission to appropriate Mesopotamia and establish a sphere of influence extending about 150 miles north of Baghdad. Not content with these promised gains, however, Premier Lloyd George, soon after the armistice, persuaded Premier Clemenceau that the Mosul oil district, still farther north, should be allotted to Britain rather than to France, although, by the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, it had been earmarked for the latter. The new arrangement hinged on Anglo-French negotiations regarding the share France was to have in Mesopotamian oil, as well as upon British consent to French plans regarding Syria. But at length these negotiations were concluded, and the mandate for Mesopotamia was assigned to Great Britain in the spring of 1920. The terms of the mandate, however, were not submitted to the League of Nations for approval until December 1920, and not until 1924 was the status of Mesopotamia definitely settled. In part, the delay was due to the long oil negotiations with the United States, which have already been reviewed, but it was also due to difficulties in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, as in Syria and in Palestine, there were Arab nationalist leaders who desired union or confederation of the Arab states, and bitterly resented both the breaking up of the Arab area into several mandates and the subjection of their country to British administration. During the years 1919 to 1920, this resentment took the form of a fairly serious Arab rebellion in Mesopotamia. Convinced that the maintenance of an unpopular British administration by crude military methods would be impossible because of the protests of the overburdened British taxpayer if for no other reason, the British government sent Sir Percy Cox to Mesopotamia with orders to conciliate the natives. He promptly appointed an Arab cabinet, with British advisers attached to each ministry, but for a permanent native government a monarch seemed necessary. The choice was none other than Prince Faisal, ex-king of Syria, who had been overthrown by the French. He came to visit, but remained to reign. With a certain amount of proper guidance, an election was held in which 96% of the votes were cast for Faisal as king. Having been duly crowned on August 23, 1921, and installed in office, King Faisal proved a statesmanlike ruler, evincing tact and wisdom, not only in his relations with his subjects, but also in his steady reliance on the help and friendship of His British Majesty's government. With King Faisal, the British drew up a Treaty of Alliance, signed October 10, 1922, which contained the provisions that would otherwise have been incorporated into a mandate. Religious freedom, the use of native languages in schools, the rights of minorities, the open door, are guaranteed as in an ordinary mandate. Footnote: as regards taxation, commerce, navigations, exercise of industries or professions, treatment of shipping and aircraft, for all members of the League and other powers with which Great Britain may make treaties promising privileges equal to those of League members, the circumlocution refers to the United States, it is significant that there is no clause on monopolistic concessions. End of footnote. Great Britain undertakes to provide the Kingdom of Iraq with advice and assistance, including military and financial aid, while on the other hand Iraq agrees to be guided by the advice of the British High Commissioner on all important matters affecting the international and financial obligations and interests of His Britannic Majesty. By a supplementary agreement, the number of British officials and their salaries were fixed. This relationship is pretty clearly what the provisions of Article 22 of the Covenant intended for A mandates. No less in harmony with the Covenant was the provision in the Iraq Treaty that Great Britain will use her good officers to secure admission of Iraq into the League of Nations as soon as possible, thereby terminating the treaty and the mandatory tutelage. If Iraq should not be admitted to the League, the treaty would remain in force 20 years. By a subsequent agreement in 1923, the 20-year term was reduced to 4, dating from the ratification of peace with Turkey, and therefore expiring in 1928. In 1925, however, in order to secure Mosul under the terms of the League Council's decision,
Great Britain agreed to renew for 25 years her treaty obligations toward Iraq, or in other words, to prolong the mandatory relationship for 25 years, subject to the possibility that it might be ended earlier by the admission of Iraq to the League. This method of fulfilling the principal mandatory trusteeship was approved by the League, although no mandate charter has been issued, as in other cases. On September 27, 1924, the Council of the League accepted the Iraq Treaty, with supplementary British pledges, as giving effect to Article 22 of the Covenant, it being understood that an annual report would be made on this, as on other mandates, that the terms should not be altered save with the Council's consent, and that British obligations should terminate when Iraq enters the League. To reassure British critics who were fearful lest the prolongation of the British mandate to the year 1950 might commit Great Britain to an expensive obligation, Premier Baldwin predicted that the mandate would probably expire, by the method indicated, before the maximum of 25 years had elapsed, and, he explained, Great Britain was not required to spend money or to keep troops in Iraq, but merely to lend cooperation and advice. As a matter of fact, it was estimated in 1925 that Great Britain had spent £150 million on the occupation and administration of Mesopotamia, and it was still expending more than £4 million per annum, although the British Army of Occupation had been reduced to some air squadrons and 1 battalion of infantry. The return on the investment must depend on the future development of the country. Probably British political influence aided the British-controlled Turkish Petroleum Company to secure its concessions in 1925 for exclusive prospecting rights, but the company's profits will depend on the settlement of the Mosul boundary dispute with Turkey, and upon the success of the prospecting, and upon the drilling of oil wells and the construction of a pipeline to the Syrian coast. Cotton and grain likewise are potential assets, and are being cultivated on an ever-increasing irrigated area. Yet these also depend on the extension of irrigation, as well as upon the general conditions in Iraq. On the other hand, British taxpayers may possibly derive some satisfaction from the knowledge that on the whole British administration has been remarkably successful, under difficult circumstances, in establishing a friendly and apparently stable native government, in extending the railway system, in encouraging agriculture, in laying foundations for a modern educational system, in providing hospital facilities and combating epidemics, despite the fact that such humane reforms and economic enterprises have been sadly handicapped by the paucity of funds left after defraying the heavy military expenses. Subsection B mandates in Central Africa. 6 B mandates were carved out of 3 former German colonies as follows: Togoland into British Togoland, 12,600 square miles, 185,000 people. French Togoland, 22,000 square miles, 747,000 people. Cameroon into British Cameroons, 31,000 square miles, 550,000 people. French Cameroon, 166,489 square miles, not including 107,000 square miles which had been ceded from French Equatorial Africa to German Cameroon in 1911 and were simply reincorporated into French Equatorial Africa. 2,771,000 people. German East Africa into Tanganyika Territory, British, 365,000 square miles, 4,125,000 people. Rwanda-Urundi, Belgium, 21,235 square miles, 3 million people. It will be noticed that France secured most of Togoland and Cameroon, the western colonies, whereas Great Britain took German East Africa. Belgium, indignant at being ignored in the first distribution of mandates, persuaded the British to relinquish the northwestern corner of East Africa, which Belgian Congolese troops had occupied. This district, by the way, is much more important in population and productivity than its small area would indicate, for it includes some of the finest African highlands, where cattle are plentiful. Between the Arab A mandates and these B mandates there is a world of difference. The latter are without exception tropical lands. Much of their surface is covered by the dense equatorial jungle and drenched by tropical rains. Their inhabitants are uncivilized Negroes, ranging in culture, or lack of it, from the cattle-growing tribesmen to forest savages. Obviously, there can be no national self-determination here, as in the case of the Arabs. Mandates in this case must not mean transitional tutelage over adolescent nations, but must give the mandatory power, full powers of administration and legislation, to govern the country as an integral part of the mandatory's territory. As a matter of fact, the policy has been generally pursued of governing through the native tribal chieftains, wherever possible, as the British report on Togoland for 1923 declares.
The general policy adopted since the British occupation has been to support native rule and rulers.
The Belgian report for 1924 contains the interesting statement, "The chiefs are the pivot of native policy. The importance of their role is of the first order, and a wise organization of chieftainships is the most potent means of action one can have. Where the chief is won over to European influence, just and respected, progress is rapid, order assured. Where the chief is hostile, tyrannical, or without authority, our influence on the population is, on the contrary, very ineffective." In some cases, the chiefs are allowed to collect the taxes, turning over a certain percentage to the central administration, or are used as agents to recruit native labour, and quite generally they are entrusted with the local administration, subject of course to the laws of the colony, and the advice or orders of the white officials. So strongly do the British prefer this method, that where no prominent native chiefs exist, they discover them, and deliberately build up their authority. This, indeed, is done in other British West African colonies, as well as in the mandates, but it is fairly characteristic of the problem of government in the mandates. Otherwise one must install white officials, and it is not easy to provide a sufficient number in torrid colonies. In regions where the native villages have no tribal organizations, direct administration is necessary, but even so, the lower administrative ranks are filled by natives. The prime difference between a bee mandate and an ordinary colony is that in the former the administration is more definitely responsible before the world for a just and beneficent policy toward the natives. The very terms of the mandates prescribe explicitly that the mandatory must abolish slavery as soon as possible, suppress the slave trade, exercise a strict control over the arms and liquor traffic, prohibit compulsory labour except for essential public works, and supervise labour contracts so as to protect the natives from exploitation. Accordingly, the mandatories have prohibited the slave traffic and abolished slavery in law, although in some cases the institution of domestic slavery among the natives is too firmly rooted to be at once eradicated. Fairly elaborate laws regulating the terms of native labour contracts have been promulgated. The importation of arms and distilled liquor is usually restricted rigorously. It is interesting, for Americans, to note that the French policy is to promote the consumption of hygienic beverages, such as wines and beer, instead of the deadly whiskey, gin, and rum. The mandates also forbid the raising of native troops except for local police purposes and for the defence of the territory. On this point, however, the French were so insistently dissatisfied that in the French mandates a clause is added allowing these native troops to be used elsewhere, in Europe for example, in the event of a general war to repel an attack, or for defence of territory. Despite the importance which France attached to this permission, the reports show only 1,017 native soldiers in French Cameroon, and 455 in French Togo for 1923 through 1924. The most important issues affecting the welfare of the natives are hygiene, education and missionary work, land and labour. In the first of these, the mandatories seem eager to make as good a showing as the expense of sending doctors to Africa will allow. For instance, the French in 1922 boasted of having administered 200,000 vaccinations in Cameroon. Missions enjoy a guaranteed religious freedom and are conducting most of what educational work there is, and it is little enough. In French Cameroon, for example, there were, in 1924, some 4,700 natives attending mission schools and 3,300 attending government schools, or less than 3 students per every 1,000 of population, about the same ratio that prevails in the neighbouring French colony of Equatorial Africa. It is a difficult problem, made more difficult by the impossibility of securing or paying adequate numbers of teachers, native or white. As for the land problem, to guard against the expropriation of the natives that has been so grave an evil in colonies like Kenya and Congo, the mandates bind the mandatories to respect the rights and safeguard the interests of the native population. Since the natives have no conception of individual real property, it is not a simple matter. In the French mandates, an attempt seems to have been made to establish European ideas of land ownership immediately by the drastic measures of declaring the private domain of the state to include all vacant lands, and even lands around native villages, utilised but not owned by the villagers, and, by the way, all lands formerly owned by Germany. These lands the government could sell or lease to individuals or companies. Obviously, much will depend upon the spirit in which the administration deals with the question, whether too large a portion of these lands are assigned to concessionaires. On the other hand, to protect individual native properties, the French are endeavouring to have the natives register or matriculate their lands. In Tanganyika, the British have declared all lands to be public lands, which may be granted to planters for 99 years' use, but not sold outright. How such measures will work out in practice is not yet clear, except insofar as the desire of the mandatories to make unimpeachable reports may afford a reason for predicting a policy of safeguarding native interests. The mandate provision against compulsory labour is the most significant, as in many African colonies the natives have been forced to work for government or private interests, sometimes in lieu of other taxation, sometimes for wages that scarcely concealed the resemblance of forced labour to slavery. The mandatories may employ forced labour only on essential public works, and with adequate remuneration. In some cases a labour on public works, e.g. railways and roads, is required as a form of taxation or corvée. In French Togo, 4 days a year, in French Cameroon, 10 days, in Tanganyika, long enough to earn the amount of the hut tax in money. Footnote: the British report on labour in the Tanganyika Territory, 1926, is particularly detailed and illuminating. End footnote. Forced labour for private plantations or other private enterprises, however, is not allowed according to the letter of the law, yet in some regions where native chiefs or village headmen recruit young Negroes to become contract labourers, that is, to work under contract for a certain number of weeks or months, it is practically inevitable that an element of compulsion will enter into the process. The aim is that labour should be free, but it is not always easy to
inspire the native with a taste for work,
in the words of a French report on Cameroon. Any description of the bee mandates would be incomplete without mention of one more typical feature: the detailed guarantee of the open door. For all members of the League there must be complete economic, commercial and industrial equality. Concessions for the exploitation of natural resources must be granted without distinction of nationality, and monopolistic concessions are prohibited. For commerce, the open door is so genuine that until 1924, England had a larger share than France of the market in French Cameroon. Concessions, on the other hand, quite naturally tend to be sought by, and granted to, subjects of the mandatory power more than by foreigners. Nevertheless, it may be fairly said that the open door is a reality. The fact is more interesting in view of the cost of the mandates to the mandatories. In Tanganyika and British Cameroons there have been regular deficits to be defrayed by the British taxpayer. Belgium has granted a subsidy of 1,200,000 francs a year to balance the budget of her mandate. Only France has been able to make the taxes collected in the mandates provide a surplus over expenditures, in order to accumulate funds for ambitious programs of railway construction and other public works. Subsection: Sea mandates in the South Seas and South Africa. There remain a few other ex-German colonies to be considered, namely Southwest Africa and the Pacific Islands. These were put into a separate class of mandates, as we have seen, for quite specific reasons, because the Australasians wished to exclude the Japanese from the islands in the South Pacific, and because British South Africa wished to incorporate German Southwest Africa into its own administrative and preferential tariff system. In both cases, the open door provision could not be applied. The absence of this provision is one of the principal characteristics of the sea mandates. Another striking characteristic is their relatively small population, less than 750,000 all told, as appears from the following table. South Sea Islands, Japan, 800 square miles, 42,000 people. New Guinea, Australia, 89,000 square miles, 400,000 people. Western Samoa, New Zealand, 1,250 square miles, 38,000 people. Nauru Island, British Empire, 10 square miles, 2,000 people. Southwest Africa, Union of South Africa, 322,000 square miles, 228,000 people. The islands assigned to Japan are hundreds in number, and small in importance, except as cable or radio stations, or as coaling stations and potential naval bases. Yap, which occasioned such controversy between Japan and the United States, and caused so many newspaper readers in 1921 to consult their atlases, is one of these diminutive islands. The insular possessions of Germany south of the equator were appropriated by Great Britain and her dominions, New Zealand taking the strategic but small Samoan Islands, Australia assuming the mandate over New Guinea, former Kaiser Wilhelm's Land, Bismarck Archipelago and German Solomon Islands, and the British Empire in its collective capacity, reserving for itself the microscopic but valuable atoll of Nauru, which produces 200,000 tons of phosphate a year. Of all the islands except Nauru, the chief product is borne by the picturesque coconut palm, the kernels of whose fruit are dried and exported under the trade name copra. Southwest Africa achieved a singular prominence among the sea mandates through the Bondelsvat's rebellion, the culmination of long-standing difficulties between whites and blacks. Under German rule before the Great War, the colony had attracted some 12,000 German settlers, many of whom secured large cattle ranches, while others devoted themselves to business or to operating the profitable diamond mines. German colonization had created two acute native grievances, for the Hottentots and Bantus resented the occupation of most of their lands by the whites, and they were unwilling to be forced into the position of ill-paid labourers on ranches or in mines.
An exhortation to labour is not popular anywhere, least of all in Southwest Africa, where from time immemorial the Hereros and Hottentots have been the possessors of vast herds of stock and the land they roamed over. Constant wars with the European invader caused the loss of everything, except what the generosity or political acumen of the European left them. One can quite understand their feelings against the farmers who now occupy the land.
Against the Germans there had been a long series of native insurrections, sternly repressed, leaving bitter racial antagonism in their wake. When British South Africa took the country, some 8,000 Germans remained, and thousands of British settlers joined them, 11,000 British by 1921. These white farmers owned almost 500,000 head of cattle, and over 1 million head of sheep and goats, whereas the natives had only some 66,000 cattle and 650,000 sheep and goats. The British endeavoured to pursue a more humane policy than their predecessors, in certain respects. They prohibited, for example, the flogging of native servants and labourers by the white farmers. In certain other matters, however, the new masters of the land were severe. Because the whites complained that there were too many hunting dogs killing game, the British administration in 1921 levied a dog tax of £1 for the first dog, 10 for 5 dogs. Many of the natives, of course, were too poor to pay any such tax, and consequently, in 4 months, over 100 members of the Bondelsvat's tribe were condemned, for non-payment of the tax, to pay a fine of £2 or spend 2 weeks in jail. To obtain the money for tax and fines, the natives would have to work for white ranchers and mine owners. While the dog tax exasperated the natives, there were other grievances too, such as the practice of condemning native vagrants to work, and the fact that natives were not allowed to have branding irons, although they were required to pay 30 shillings for them. As a result,
there was much ill-feeling and enmity,
and there were constant reports
that the Hottentots were about to rise against the whites.
One small tribe of Hottentots, the Bondelsvats, did rise in 1922, somewhat less than 600 warriors,
with their women and children, went on the warpath. Against them, the government sent a force of 390 men with machine guns and airplanes, and the planes bombed the rebel camp. About 100 warriors and 2 children were killed. How many were wounded could not be told, because the Hottentots carried their wounded with them in retreat. Thus, rebellion was crushed, and the cattle owned by the tribe were captured or stampeded. When the Assembly of the League met in 1922, a coloured delegate from Haiti ventured to criticise the conduct of South Africa, and the Assembly adopted a resolution expressing its confident hope that the Permanent Mandates Commission would consider the matter and be able to report that satisfactory conditions had been established. Obeying this strong, though courteously worded injunction, the Commission devoted much of its third session in July and August 1923 to discussion of reports which had been received from an investigating commission appointed by South Africa, and to a virtual cross-examination of Major Herbst and Sir Edgar Walton, who appeared in behalf of South Africa. The Commission's report was, in effect, a rebuke to South Africa, and so unwelcome a rebuke that the delegate of that country issued a statement that
"The Commission, I am afraid, has failed altogether to realise the situation in Southwest Africa when the Union of South Africa assumed the responsibility of government."
If the Commission had ever been in South Africa, he declared, it would have been impossible to write such a report.
A report which will, I fear, be read in South Africa with bitter feeling.
Nevertheless, the League Assembly in September 1923 expressed its regret that the satisfactory conditions had not yet been reported in the Bondelsvat district. Under the lash of such international reproof, South Africa took pains, in its next annual report on the mandate, to announce that the objectionable laws had been modified, that most of their cattle had been returned to the Bondels, that rations were being given to the indigent and free medical service to the sick. Moreover, the administrator whose policy had been criticised came in person to the next meeting of the Mandates Commission with a very elaborate and conciliatory report, and with tactful words of praise for the Commission's work. The root of the trouble in Southwest Africa, he explained, was the too sudden change from the iron discipline of the Germans to the more lenient policy of the British toward the natives, especially the abolition of flogging. The natives construed British humanitarianism as weakness, and were encouraged in their hope of recovering their ancestral lands. He took pains, however, to show that South Africa had really improved conditions by more humane laws, by setting aside additional lands as native reserves, by promoting education. The Negroes were not being forced to work, but it was hoped that as their wants increased, economic pressure would induce them to seek employment. End of section 3.